Okay, welcome. Obviously, we have a 2-hour bus delay on Friday, the 20th of February. This is Mr. Barry. I am recording the lecture for Section 1 of our chapter on the Age of Imperialism. This is Part 1, the Scramble for Africa. Some of you probably have heard some of the beginning portion of this, the first half, on Thursday the 19th is actually when I'm recording this. But this is for those who may or may not be present or have missed this lecture. Hopefully I won't have to do a lot of these, but I am presenting this here for you today. Okay, let us begin. Here we go. Industrialization leads to imperialism. This is the first slide here. In the 1800s, European industrial nations wanted to show their power by creating vast empires. The reason that these nations want to do this is that they have just recently industrialized. They have a lot of new technology. They are opening markets, making more and more things because they have industrialized. And to continue to do this, they're going to really need a lot of raw materials. And probably the best way to do this, rather than, just magic, in the case of Britain, maybe Harry Potter can help them out, is to actually take over some other countries. Okay? And many of these European industrialized nations begin to see Africa as an untapped source of raw materials, especially. They also see Africa as untapped markets, places that they have not been, to this point, selling to. And they also see Africa as a source of cheap labor. And when we look at labor, of course, we mean both literally people they are going to employ for a wage and, of course, slave labor, which is usually pretty cheap. Of course, you have to pay for slave labor on the front end, but after that, not a lot of expenses incurred. That's unfortunate, but it is a truth of this matter. So they are getting raw materials. There's a lot of gold, tin, copper, that kind of thing in Africa. So they're going to bring that into use for industrialization. They are going to, on some level, sell things to people. So they are creating wealth and capital. And again, they have labor for people to work on. So they are satisfying the three factors of production, which you'll remember from our section on the industrialization of Europe and the United States. So you have, again, raw materials covers land, basically, in the factors of production. You have markets, which creates capital or money to invest in the industrialization, and you have labor, both in paid labor and slavery. So this begins the age of imperialism and the scramble for Africa more specifically, which is what we'll talk about today in this lecture. Now, first of all, let's look about what is imperialism. Imperialism is, very simply, and we'll give you two definitions here, the seizure or taking of a country or territory by a stronger country, or the other definition, in green here, a policy in which a strong nation seeks to dominate other countries politically, economically, or socially. Please keep in mind this is one of your vocab words, so you need to keep that written down either in your notes guide if you're in college prep, or just keep that on your running vocab list if you're in honors. I really enjoyed this poster, actually. It has been sanitized a bit for the use in this lecture, but imperialism, you see here, Uncle Sam and Britannia, or Britannia, I forget how her name is pronounced, actually leading imperialism. This is their personifications of the United States and Britain. And it says, "We'll kick your butt and then steal your stuff." That's pretty much what countries do when they take over other nations. You also see the king there, of course. He is very interested in the nice country that he'll take. So that's what imperialism. It's taking over of a country by a country. If that makes sense. All right. Now, before we talk about the actual cutting up of Africa, the scramble itself, I think it would be good for us to talk about what is Africa like before European domination. Now, before Europeans become heavily involved in Africa, most of Africa before the 1800s, that is, was divided into hundreds, if not thousands, of different peoples who are very ethnically and culturally unique. Some of these people had large empires, some of them have small countries, some of them were on the, just small as the village level. You have varying different degrees of statehood occurring in Africa, but most of them are not really very solidified. You don't have countries in the way that we look at them today. South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia are very well-defined states in the United States. We understand where they are. The borders are very specific. You can go to geological surveys and they'll tell you exactly where one state begins and ends. That is not the case in Africa. Okay, some of them are on top of each other, as you can see in the map on the right. Some of them are far flung from each other. They're just them and there's no one else. There are sections in northern Africa where there are no populations to speak of because there are vast deserts. The central portions of Africa, while they have a lot of water, are densely forested and have lots of jungle, so there's not a lot of great coalesced nations there. And you'll notice that there are not any of the nations that we would now understand making up Africa. They're loosely knit communities and empires of various sizes and shapes and of people. You can take a lot of different people in Africa. That if you go to the northern portion, you have Libya and Egypt, and you could pair those people up with people from Zimbabwe and people from South Africa during the period before Europe, and they would not resemble each other at all. I mean, they're very, very different people with very different cultures. And that is something I think Americans, especially high school students, frequently misunderstand, is that Africa is very large. It is, in fact, the largest continent on the planet. You can carry the entire landmass of the United States, Canada, China, and Europe in the size that Africa is. People generally will discount it just because of how cartographers, those people who are making maps, actually show it on a globe. It actually looks smaller than it really is. But there are a lot of people there, and they are very culturally diverse. Now, anyway, let's continue. Europe had been trading with Africa since about the 1450s. Portugal specifically had made some trading cities on the eastern and western coasts, and they actually went around the Cape of Good Hope, which is basically the very southern point of Africa. And they had gone around there to get to India and China to trade, of course. And so they do leave some trade centers on their way there. Part of what also keeps Europeans from going into Central Africa or the interior of Africa is the hazardous conditions that occur there. You obviously have a lot of animals and plants, especially mosquitoes, that can kill you in Africa. But you also have African armies, which were fairly strong. Previous to the 1800s, they could put up a pretty good fight against European armies, considering, bows and arrows are pretty much bows and arrows regardless of where you go. They may not have necessarily had the plate armor that Europeans may have had, but they certainly would outnumber them if they were just coming by ship, which would generally be the case. Okay, so most Europeans really did not have much more than coastal trading cities previous to the 1800s. Okay, so that's really what Africa's like before European domination. Now, what then would lead Europe to become dominant over Africa? Well, there are a few forces driving imperialism there. The first one we're going to talk about here is European superiority. Many Europeans believe that Europeans were superior to other people. They actually basically believed that they were the pinnacle of human history. There was no other greater people than, say, the British or the French or the Portuguese or the Italians or whoever it is happened to be taking over the certain portion of Africa. Okay, Europeans were the best people there were. That was kind of their view. Obviously, this is, not necessarily true. I'm sure there are some very good European people, but what this really boils down to at this point is Europeans just generally, and I'm not saying everybody, we're being racist, okay? And this is another one of your vocab words. Racism is a hatred of a people based on race or ethnicity, okay? Plain and simple. It still exists today. If you're not familiar at all with racism, this is good that you're hearing it now. But that's what it is, okay? And Europeans pretty much were being racist towards Africans. They do what a lot of people tend to make the mistake of doing, which is they see Africa and go, Africa, black people, they're poor because they're dumb, that kind of thing. And that's what Europeans pretty much did at this period of time. And they did this mostly because of the second thing here, the theory of social Darwinism. And social Darwinism basically said to the Europeans that African nations were poor because they were inferior. Specifically, they're applying Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution and survival of the fittest. A lot of you guys have heard that term in biology class when you talk about evolution, but this is being applied to human society. Basically what it says is those who were fittest for survival enjoyed wealth and success and were considered superior to others. According to the theory, non-Europeans were considered to be on a lower scale of cultural and physical development because they had not made the scientific and technological process that Europeans had. Europeans believed that they had the right and the duty to bring the results of their progress to other countries. So pretty much they really felt it was their burden to make Africa more like them, to bring them back to their level, that kind of thing. But basically they're looking at African nations that they're poor because they were inferior. They hadn't learned all these things that Europeans had learned. Again, thus Europeans are better and Africans are inferior. At least that was the theory. Now, we know, obviously, that that doesn't necessarily hold because you and I have probably both known a lot of people who, if the theory of survival of the fittest had held, would probably not be alive today. I know I do, your parents probably do, you probably do. Okay? So social Darwinism doesn't necessarily hold all the time, although when you look at it from the perspective of Europeans, it does seem to make sense. They see all these people who don't have the knowledge that they have, that they're inferior, they don't industrialize, that kind of thing, and so thus obviously they're poor, and it is our responsibility as Europeans to fix that problem. Thirdly, we should also see that there is a drive to Christianize or Westernize foreign peoples. There is just a general need by Europeans a lot of the time to actually just create Christians. Okay, there is a push from the church during this period to get them to really bring in more converts. So there's that as well. To be clear, Charles Darwin did not come up with social Darwinism. It is something that was created after his theories on evolution. They're just applying them to people, to be clear. Now, what are some other factors helping imperialism in Africa? We're going to look at this really briefly as well. So it's not just like obviously that Europeans are superior. We also want to see, well, what helped them actually be successful in Africa. And part of that is that Europeans had especially had better technology. Okay? And especially technology in guns and manufacturing of industrial goods, okay? And we want to look at guns specifically because if you know me, you know I work, my other job is I work at a gun counter at Academy Sports and Outdoors, work in hunting and fishing. And I also collect World War I and II firearms. So I'll never give up an opportunity to speak about the historical importance of guns and that kind of thing. And one of the things that was invented by Europeans during the mid to late 1800s, actually 1884, was the machine gun, and more specifically the Maxim machine gun. And the story goes basically that Hiram Maxim is an American inventor, and he is at a dinner, I believe, with a bunch of Europeans during the Industrial Revolution, and they say, Hiram, if you want to make a lot of money, here's what you should do. You should invent something that allows Europeans to kill themselves and their enemies more efficiently. He takes this literally and actually creates the first workable machine gun, now known as the Maxim machine gun, and then later also developed into what we would call the Vickers machine gun, which is used heavily in World War I, which we'll talk about later on this year. But anyway, this allows them to fight very effectively against the Africans and other nations that they are going to go into imperially. India, Asia, etc. are a little bit behind on firearms development as well. And so this gives them a distinct advantage over these people they're trying to take over, as you might imagine. They have bows and arrows. Some of them even have muskets, single shot rifles, that kind of thing. At very best, they have bolt-action rifles, but none of the people they're fighting in Africa have machine guns. Okay, so they are at a vast military advantage. Europeans also had other technologies that allowed them to be very successful in Africa. Specifically, they had steam engines, which were created during the Industrial Revolution as well. These allowed them ease of travel, both by railroad, train, and by river on steamboats. You can see down there on the bottom right, there's a photo, or actually an etching, I suppose, of a scene out of Hearts of Darkness. It's a Joseph Conrad novel, which you'll probably read later on in your high school career or in college, where they talk about using a steamship to go to the heart of Africa, the dark heart of Africa. And this was really a method that was used very frequently to travel the interior of Africa. And it was very efficient because a lot of African rivers actually flowed outward towards the coast, and so previous to this kind of technology, it was actually very, very difficult for Europeans to get into the interior in any sort of efficient manner. Also, Europeans had a drug called quinine, which cured malaria. Malaria is, of course, a disease that is carried by mosquitoes, and is very, very common in Africa and several other countries outside of Europe. It's not very common where we live, but it was something that was to be legitimately feared in Africa, because many people die, even to this day, of malaria for lack of treatment. So having quinine really helped that a lot. The many different nations of Africa also contributed to its ease in being conquered. Because you have no real large national defense in Africa, there are no real cohesive countries to fight against Europeans in any effective way. This allows them to kind of take over more easily. So those things really help imperialism in Africa. Now, because imperialism is really going to start taking off in the late 1800s, the 1880 or so, a lot of European nations begin to become concerned that they are going to begin fighting each other. At the time, the French began to expand from West African coast towards what we know as Western Sudan. The discoveries of diamonds in 1867 and the gold in 1886 in South Africa increased European interest in colonizing the continent. So really no European power wants to be left behind or out of the race. And to this end, they're going to come together at a meeting called the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference took place in 1884 to 1885, and basically what it does is it sets out the rules for colonizing Africa. Obviously, based on the name, it takes place in what is now Berlin, Germany. Now, what happens basically at the meeting is 14 European nations decided that here's the rule. Any European country could control part of Africa simply by notifying the rest of Europe and demonstrating the power to control the area. It should also be noted here that African nations were not consulted in any way during this conference. No African leader or monarch was, in fact, invited to attend, and so the conference basically sealed Africa's fate without their being consulted. By 1914, really only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free from European control. They were the only ones who had not either been conquered or selected by Europe in this cutting up or scramble for Africa. Also note here, by the way, Berlin Conference is one of your vocabulary words. It is a meeting at which representatives of European nations agreed upon the rules of colonization of Africa, 1884, 1885. It is important to note that Europeans were not generally concerned with the people that were actually living in the areas that they took control of. I really like this map that comes from your book. It shows the traditional ethnic boundaries of Africa, and then the political boundaries that have been kind of drawn by European nations after the scramble for Africa. You'll notice actually that the red boundaries show the ethnic groups. And there are, I would say, hundreds of them. And you can even see, if you look in the kind of the top, say, northwestern portion of Africa, the large rounded side, that you can actually see the borders, the white lines going straight through where some of these ethnic groups are. They cut them basically in half, and there is no consideration for where people actually live. The actual quote that your book gives is that the European nations divided the continent with little thought about how African ethnic or linguistic groups were distributed. It's pretty accurate if you look at this one. So just be aware that when they divided this, there was no consideration about where anybody lived. Now, what really is driving a lot of the imperialism in Africa? And part of the answer to that is there's a great demand for resources, and this demand for resources is going to shape colonies in Africa. Raw materials led Europeans to create colonies in Africa, obviously. You do have markets and you do have the pull of labor, but the main thing is raw materials. One of the main things that Europeans found, we've kind of already mentioned this, in the 1860s and 80s, things like gold and diamonds are discovered in Africa, and so this becomes a really big draw for Europeans, diamonds especially. To this day, literally, millions of dollars of diamonds are mined from Africa. Some of these diamonds are what are called blood diamonds, and there's a great deal of information of this on the internet, but here's what I will tell you about that. Blood diamonds basically are diamonds that are mined in Africa and then are sold to fund wars around the world. There are diamonds at this very moment, I guarantee you, being mined to fund terrorist activity in the Middle East. There are diamonds being mined in Africa right now to fund wars between Ukraine and Russia. There are diamonds especially being mined to fund wars in Africa. You can see a picture here below the diamonds of a child soldier in Africa. This is a very unfortunately common thing that occurs in Africa. People are disfigured for disobeying governments that want them to mine these things and sell them for the funding of wars. It is an incredibly unfortunate situation. Young men and women, probably no older than yourselves, you guys are 15, 16 years old or so, are fighting wars in Africa over this kind of thing. They're fighting over ethnic disputes, sure, but a lot of them are fighting over the funding of diamonds and that kind of thing that occur over there. So raw material production in Africa is a major problem that can still be causing issues today. But it is a big draw for European nations. They're coming there for diamonds. They're coming there also for gold and tin and copper and other mineral resources which are also present in Africa. Okay. Now, we are going to see three groups clash over South Africa. I'm going to kind of move there briefly. The Zulu tribe had controlled South Africa for some time. Obviously, they are natives to that area, and one of their leaders was named Shaka. And Shaka Zulu, he's sometimes called, had created a large centralized state, which is really uncommon to Africa at that period. It was pretty well organized. They had very organized military. In a lot of cases, they were able to fight fairly effectively against European powers. However, not to simplify this, we don't have all day. The British eventually defeated the Zulus and took over South Africa. I say took over because they beat them, of course, but this actually becomes sort of a problem because guess what? The British are not the only Europeans there. The British actually had to then fight against the Dutch, who had come to South Africa before they had, and they were going to fight the Dutch for control of what we now know as South Africa. This war between Britain and the Dutch is called the Boer War. And we are going to switch slides here so we can talk about that a little bit more. Now, the Boer War. The Boer War, again, is a war between Britain and Dutch settlers in South Africa, the Dutch began to settle in South Africa around the 1650s. When navigating around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, okay? So they're with Portuguese and everybody else who's traveling around the bottom portion of Africa to get, wherever they're going, India, Asia, that kind of thing. Now, these settlers, who were Dutch, were known as Boers. This is the Dutch word for farmers. And they fought with the British when they took control of the Cape Colony in the early 1800s from the Zulu. When diamonds and gold were found there in the 1860s and 70s, people began to stream into South Africa. It is interesting to note here that the Boers, of course, didn't live peacefully with the Zulu either. During a period actually called the Great Trek, the Boers moved north into the northern portion of what's now South Africa. They actually had to fight very fiercely with the Zulu and other African groups that whose land they were taking. Anyway, when diamonds and gold were discovered in southern Africa in the 1860s and 80s, suddenly adventurers from all parts of the world rushed in to make their fortunes. The Boers tried to keep these outsiders from gaining political rights, and there was an attempt to start a rebellion against the Boers. This rebellion failed, but the Boers blamed the British, and in 1899 they took arms up against them. The Boer War is often cited as the first modern total war. Things like commando raids and guerrilla tactics were used by the Dutch. You start to see a lot of things that we would recognize today as modern military tactics. Native Africans, it should be noted, often fought on the side of the Dutch and Boer side because they actually disliked the English more than they disliked the Boers. They didn't really like either of them terribly, but the Boers were seen as kind of the lesser of two evils, I suppose you could say. The British were very harsh in their fighting of this war. They were known to have done things such as burn Boer farms, and they also imprisoned women and children in disease-ridden concentration camps. So let us not think that this was sort of your typical European war. This is really what we would understand as a total war. Nothing is sacred. They are fighting against each other very, very contentiously. A lot of bad things are occurring. Things that we will see reoccur during World War I and II. Eventually, Britain wins in 1910, and the area officially becomes the Union of South Africa, what is essentially the country we know today. Well, that is obviously a oversimplification of the Boer War, but just to give you an idea kind of what is going on. Now, colonies are going to signal some change in Africa. The establishing of colonies in Africa changed the way of life for Africans. Obviously, Europeans are involved in their life more than ever. And Europeans made efforts to change the political, social, and economic lives of people that they conquered. Some of this was welcome, some of it was not welcome at all. We will see a lot more of this in Section 2, which is a case study on Nigeria and the imperialism and colonization efforts there. Thanks for listening. Hopefully I won't have to do very many of these in the future, but just to get those who may have missed it caught up, that is Section 1 of Chapter 11 Notes for Global Studies 2. Thanks.